Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I will now introduce today's presenter, Victoria Basulto. Victoria is a Colgate University alumna from the class of 2021, where she received her bachelor's in history and English. She is currently an MPhil in World History student at the University of Cambridge. Her research centers on U.S. and Latin American foreign relations, and has worked extensively with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum to create educational content on U.S. history, particularly regarding abolitionism and the Black American experience. She served as an Upstate Institute Fellow at NAHOF in 2021, where she produced the educational series Black History Matters 2021 and produced Black History in Upstate New York as a Davis Projects for Peace Fellow over the summer. Victoria continues her work with NAHOF as a cabinet member on the Educational Programming Committee. Victoria is also active in international nonprofit work, serving as a grant writer for Partners for Andean Community Health as a 2021 recipient of the Princeton and Latin America Fellowship. Victoria will now begin her presentation.
Hello and welcome to my presentation for today. So this presentation is going to be a bit different. For it, I took a quick trip to Galveston, Texas during the summer of 2021 in order to see physical markers of Juneteenth. So I grew up in Houston, Texas, about 1 hour from Galveston. The city is actually closer, but I live in the north part of the city, so it's a bit farther. But having grown up in Houston, I visited Galveston quite a few times as a child, but never had the opportunity to become acquainted with the history of the island, much less that of Juneteenth. So while in Galveston, I decided to visit 3 sites of historical importance to the island and to the history of Juneteenth. But because it was windy on that day, I will be narrating over the video clips that I have, as it is not clear what I'm saying due to the microphone being blown out. And I also apologize for the shakiness of some of the filming, as my brother was my unwilling cameraman that day. But before that, a quick history on the island of Galveston itself. So Galveston gets its name from a Spanish colonial governor and viceroy named Bernardo de Galvez y Madrid, whose career spanned the 1700s. So it was known as Galvez's town, or Galveston as it's known today. The first settlement came to being around 1816 and was created by the Republic of Mexico during its ongoing independence war with Spain, which lasted from 1810 to 1821. The port itself was established in 1825 by Mexico. And the island has a long history that involves the Texas Revolution of 1836, which ended with Texas gaining its independence from Mexico and briefly establishing itself as the Republic of Texas, which existed as a sovereign nation state until 1846, when it became part of the United States when it was annexed. But during these events, the port of Galveston served as an important piece of the history of this area. It was the main port for the Texas Navy and the temporary capital of the Republic. And during the 19th century, Galveston was a major commercial center, at one point being the state's largest city. The city's historical significance is commemorated through plaques like the one that you see on your screen at the moment, which is located on a park near the historic center. There's a lot of these around. If you just sort of take a small tour through the city, you'll see a lot of them giving you brief histories of buildings history, as well as history of the island. And so across the city, some of the plaques that I saw talked about how the city was very important for promoting the wealth of the state. So it was considered one of the richest cities in the world, given that its purpose as a prime port, where a lot of ships from Liverpool and New York constantly traveled to promote trade and transport people. For the purposes of today's presentation, Galveston is important because in 1865, it became the area where General Gordon Granger, who would inform the people of Texas that slavery had been outlawed, arrived, thus making Texas the last state to end slavery following the Civil War. So Juneteenth is a celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. It is celebrated yearly on June 19th, and it marks the day that freedom was proclaimed for the enslaved people of Texas. In June 2021, President Joe Biden signed a bill making June 19th a national holiday, but in some places it was already a state holiday. For example, in Texas, which was the first state to declare Juneteenth a state holiday, in 1980 already gave paid leave for government employees. But this is important because it sort of demonstrates the historical significance of this day, not just for the state, but also nationally. So Juneteenth was first celebrated in 1866 in Galveston and marked the one-year anniversary of Order Number 3, which was given on June 19, 1865. This date is important to keep in mind because it was 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and about 2 months after the end of the Civil War. The reason that Juneteenth is a separate day from the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was on January 1st, 1863, is because of the ineffectiveness of that proclamation to liberate the enslaved people of Texas until after the end of the war. So firstly, the Emancipation Proclamation had not universally liberated all enslaved people in the United States. What it did do was outlaw slavery in states in rebellion with the Union, basically the states that were under the Confederacy at the time. And as you can see on the map on your screen, all of the states that are colored in this map were slaveholding states. The states in red were those in rebellion with the Union, and therefore the states to which the proclamation applied. The blue ones were those that sided with the Union and therefore would be allowed to keep their enslaved population in order to appease them and to ensure that they stayed on the side of the Union. However, because those red states were at war with the Union, they did not obey the laws or decrees of the United States. For obvious reasons, because they were rebelling and so they weren't going to enact any laws passed by Abraham Lincoln. So the only way to really enforce the Emancipation Proclamation was to have Union troops in the area, so in the actual states that were rebelling. And few Union troops were present in Texas by the end of the war, and therefore enforcement there had been slow before the arrival of Granger at Galveston. In fact, there was still fighting in Texas even after the Civil War had technically ended on April 9th, 1865. There was the Battle of Palmito Ranch, which was fought on May 12th and 13th in 1865 at Brownsville, Texas, which is in the Texas-Mexico border. This lateness in sort of ending the Civil War in Texas also happened because the Trans-Mississippi Army, which was the one that was fighting in Texas, only surrendered on May 26, 1865. Despite Robert E. Lee having surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Which is why General Gordon Granger did not arrive in Galveston until June 18th in time to make the proclamation on June 19th. And he was commanding 2,000 federal troops to enforce emancipation and a transition of power. So the official liberation of enslaved people in Texas is important because the slaveholding population in Texas had grown substantially by then, since the beginning of the war. Many planters and other slaveholders had migrated into Texas from eastern states to escape the fighting, and many brought enslaved people with them. This meant that the enslaved population in Texas had increased substantially by the end of the Civil War. By 1865, there were an estimated 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. Something just to keep in mind is that although Juneteenth marks the end of slavery in Texas, There were still enslaved people in the border states of Delaware and Kentucky up until December 18th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified. And the 13th Amendment was the one that officially ended slavery by stating neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So why is recognizing Juneteenth important? Well, for one, it demonstrates that the end of slavery was not quick, easy, or universal. Second, the order itself utilizes racist language that stereotypes the formerly enslaved and perpetuates ideas that will be seized on by whites seeking to oppress freedmen and women during the era of Jim Crow and Reconstruction coming right after the end of the Civil War. I guess I can read a little excerpt from the General Order number 3, just to demonstrate what I mean by this. So on your screen, you have an excerpt, which is, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. So the language of idleness used here is a stereotype that whites applied to enslaved people, believing them to be naturally idle or lazy and therefore in need of being enslaved. And after the end of slavery, Black codes were put in place in southern states that criminalized Black people by making unemployment, loitering, or even movement illegal for them. If a Black person was unemployed, he or she could be imprisoned, and imprisonment would serve as a slavery by another name. So as the 13th Amendment made it legal to enslave someone who was convicted of a crime, this legal loophole remains to this day and sort of perpetuated not just a stereotype, but also a form of slavery after slavery had officially ended.
So, when I visited Galveston, I traveled to 3 sites that Granger visited as he moved through Galveston on June 19th. The first place is the Union Army headquarters at the Osterman Building, which is no longer present, but there is a plaque there to commemorate it. The second place is the Custom House and Courthouse. And the third place is the Reedy Chapel AME. So I will show you some clips of when I visited the sites. In this clip, we are standing in the historic center of downtown Galveston, and this is called the Strand. This image shows the Strand in 1860 and 1870, and to the right, we have what used to be the Osterman Building, but is now a parking lot. However, there is a plaque there to commemorate the location, as well as a mural behind it, which we will look at shortly. So in this video, like I mentioned, the wind was blowing too hard, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm just talking about the Water Plexus, which is essentially what I've already said about the Osterman Building, but important to notice is that right behind the sign, there is a mural piece of artwork, which we're going to see next, but it's just there to sort of remind people of the history, and I think it demonstrates just how vibrant the culture of Juneteenth is still present in Galveston itself. You walk the streets and you see this memory there. So the mural that you see here is titled Absolute Equality, and it is located in the parking lot behind the plaque that we just saw earlier and what used to be the Osterman Building. Just to give you a scale of its size, here's a picture of me walking up to it just to see how enormous it is. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting piece. There were a lot of people visiting it when I was there, and it just goes to demonstrate the power that art has to remind us of history. So next to the mural, there are a couple of useful posters that talk about some of the organizations that worked on the mural, as well as its purpose, in collaboration with other organizations doing some work with the community. And I think I would like to read a little bit from the Absolute Equality poster, which you're seeing on, that I have my hand on right now at the moment. But basically, the mural was painted by Reginald Adams, and it was sponsored by the Juneteenth Legacy Project. And as I mentioned, The mural itself is called Absolute Equality, and the 5,000 square foot art installation displays 4 portraits depicting an evolutionary narrative. The poster states that there are 5 different evolutionary steps. The first one is it portrays enslaved Africans being marched onto ships, including Esteban, the first non-native enslaved person to arrive in Texas in 1528. It also has Harriet Tubman, the leader of the Underground Railroad that ferried enslaved black people to freedom. It has Abraham Lincoln holding the Emancipation Proclamation. It has General Gordon Granger issuing General Order No. 3 on Juneteenth, flanked by black Union soldiers. And it has the words of General Order No. 3, which included the phrase absolute equality, from which the mural gets its name. But yeah, so here's just a little bit more of that view so that you can get a good sense of how that narrative plays out in the actual mural. The second place that General Gordon Granger visited, quite literally 5-minute walk from the Osterman building, was the Federal Customs House. And today, if you go there, there's a sign that talks a little bit about the history of the building. It has a picture of what it used to look like in 1857, as well as a little biography of how the building came to be and its purpose that it served throughout subsequent time periods. But it's a very nice building to go visit, and as I mentioned, it's a fairly short walk from the Osterman building, and this whole tour is quite easy to do as well on foot on a good weather day. The third and final location that the general visited in order to read out the order was the Reedy AME Church. This church actually was established after the land was granted to the black population of Galveston in 1848. It is not the original building. The original building was destroyed during a hurricane, and this location was actually used after the Civil War to educate a lot of freedmen and women. And today it is also still the location where a lot of Juneteenth celebrations are held. This map is just to demonstrate the proximity of all of these locations. It's a very short walk between them, and I highly recommend that if you're ever in the area, you not only walk through downtown historic Galveston, but also visit these sites. Each site has an informational sign next to it, so you can read more about the history there, as well as other buildings surrounding the area, which I am sure are tied also into the history of Juneteenth or the history of enslavement in Galveston itself. The purpose of this presentation was essentially to give the audience the opportunity to experience what I think is a little bit of living history, given that Juneteenth is obviously still a very big part of the culture of the city. And I think experiencing history by walking through these places and seeing the actual physical locations is a great way to keep the memory alive and to understand the commemoration behind this date. If you'd like to learn more about Juneteenth, I have linked some resources in the video description for you to check out. I will also ask that you fill out a brief survey, which is also linked in the video description. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects like this one. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Thank you so much for joining us on this educational journey today. Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.